Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for episode 4, the season finale of La Historia Uncovered, a series where we are exploring lesser-known Latinx history, hosted and created by the incredible Julissa Arce. I'm so thrilled to be here to introduce this episode featuring Julia Barajas and Dr. Maylee Blackwell, in conversation on how mujeres of the Chicano civil rights movement shaped, challenged, and pushed the movement forward. My name is Monica Ramirez, and I'm one of the proud co-founders of Puede. Puede is a new digital lifestyle community that inspires, affirms, and informs Latinas to leverage our power in a way that transforms our lives, our families, and our communities. We want Latinas to feel empowered in every way, from your career to home life to casting your vote this November, and even what Latinas are reading. That is why it's an honor for us to partner with Julissa for La Historia Uncovered, alongside We All Grow, BESE, and Latino Rebels, to shine a light on Latinx history and our contributions to this country. Together, as a united front, we can strengthen our knowledge of deep roots of our community and make real change for our future. And now I present to you Julissa, an activist, writer, and nationally best-selling author of My Underground American Dream and Someone Like Me. And as I mentioned, Julissa is the creator of this incredible program, La Historia Uncovered.
Hi, everyone. I am so deeply excited and thankful. Most of all, I think the word that keeps coming to my mind today is gratitude. And I am just so grateful for all of you for being with us this past 4 weeks. And I'm especially grateful for all of our partners, We All Grow Latina, Puede, BESE, Latino Rebels, and for Ana Flores, with whom I could not have done this without her. So welcome to the season finale of La Historia Uncovered. And I am calling it a season finale because I really do hope that we are able to continue these conversations. I think that the one thing that I learned over the past 4 weeks is that there is so much more to uncover. There are so many more stories to be told. There's so much more history that we need to be rooted in. And over the last 4 weeks, we have covered so many things. We've covered things like how imperialism of the United States has led to migration. We've covered the freedom struggles of Latin America and how they've shaped democracy worldwide. We have covered, we spent an entire episode talking about Puerto Rico and the colonial state of the island. We talked about the Latino identity and all of its limitations. And today we are going to center the history, voices, and contributions of Chicanas, of las mujeres. We have saved the very best for last. Although every conversation has been fascinating, I'm really, really thrilled that we are ending here, that we are ending with centering the voices and contributions of women, and especially and particularly Latinas. So to help us learn some of those stories and histories of Chicanas in the feminist movement and in the civil rights movement is UCLA professor Maylee Blackwell, who is an oral historian and author of Chicana Power and the co-editor of Chicana Movidas. And Julia Barajas, who is a Los Angeles Times reporter, and she was part of a group of journalists who wrote a beautiful tribute commemorating the Chicano moratorium, and specifically she co-authored Chicana Revolt as part of the series. And just before we bring on our esteemed panelist, just want to say a quick note, which you've heard me say if you've been with us over the past few weeks, which is that we need your help so that more people learn about La Historia Uncovered. And the best way to help us is to spread the word through social media or tell a friend. So if you are tweeting tonight or if you're posting on Instagram, please use the hashtag La Historia Uncovered. And my Instagram and Twitter handles are at Julissa Arce. And now here is Julia and Maylee.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to the program. I'm so excited to have both of you on. Okay, so just to kind of get us started, as reflecting about this essay that I read in Chicano Movidas, the one that was written by Marta Cotera, and in it she writes that feminists passionate about self-determination have been part of every decolonization and liberation movement of the Mexican and Mexican American community since the Spanish invasion in 1492. And so then I started thinking, that's amazing. Like, we've been part of every movement, but how many feminist Chicana Latina icons did we learn about in school? And I don't mean like in college and in our doctorates, but I mean like in elementary school, in middle school, in pop culture, who are still celebrated today. I did like a Google search recently of just like feminist icons, and all of this list had women like Eleanor Roosevelt and Gloria Steinem. And then I'm glad that they had some famous Black women that I did learn about in school, like Audre Lorde and Angela Davis. And there were even some men that were part of these feminist icon lists. But all of this list were missing Chicanas in them, Latinas in them. I mean, some of these lists even left out people like Frida Kahlo, which was kind of a little bit crazy. Like, how do you leave out Frida Kahlo from this list? Like, if no one else, you can put Frida Kahlo in your list. So I'm wondering, in your own experience for both of you, when did you learn about Chicana feminists? And why do you think that their contributions have been largely erased from sort of quote unquote the mainstream, from conventional studies?
Thank you. I just want to thank you for the invitation to speak today and to be here with Julia. And just recognize that I'm calling from Tongva territory. I'm on indigenous unceded lands that have been stolen, and I appreciate the opportunity to come speak about women in the Chicano movement and women in history who have been erased. So I think, there's the question of when did you meet your first Chicana feminist, and certainly around the neighborhood, kind of underground feminists, tias, and those kinds of things. Definitely women who maybe didn't use the F word, feminism, but were definitely, breadwinners, had a sense of gender justice, were, kind of walking the walk, right, if not the talk. But I did, I came in college, and I think I may have gone to college a lot earlier than both of you, in the late 80s and 90s. And the story, especially of feminism, was still a white story. And so that's when I started interviewing Ana Nieto Gomez, and that ended up being one of the early pioneering Chicana feminists in the Chicano movement in Los Angeles, and wrote, after a 20-year journey, just with many of the stories of women in the Chicano movement in Los Angeles, the book Chicana Power, before Chicano Movidas. And so I think in part because of the stereotypes, I think of Chicana Latina women, Chicanx, femme-identified folks, as we're all expanding the experience of our history. But I think it has to do with the stereotypes of kind of a virgin whore dichotomy, right? That either Latinas are spitfires in the media representation, they're going to steal your man, or they're long-suffering women who, are so oppressed they can't speak for themselves. So I think those kinds of dynamics are still very much alive, at least in media representations. And in the scholarship in social movement histories, I think in part Chicanas are erased because the history of social struggle, especially in the 1960s, is told through the hero narrative, right? So we're waiting for the next Martin Luther King, the next Cesar Chavez, right? And that does a disservice to the historical memory of thousands and thousands of everyday people who were in the streets, who transformed society, but also, of course, the women, right? Who were there, who basically, church women were the women who made Martin Luther King like a force. And of course, Cesar Chavez organized with Dolores Huerta, who's slowly being more recognized as one of the leaders of the 1960s and 70s. So I think there's a long tradition of erasure of women of color and Chicana women, Mexicana women. But I also think there's an East Coast bias to the way U.S. history is taught and told, as if it kind of starts with manifest destiny and moves, west. And so West Coast, the idea that this was Mexico, was indigenous land, was Mexico, those kinds of stories aren't really told, because our national imaginary comes like manifest destiny from east to west. And so I think some of those colonial narratives, of course, are part of the erasure.
Yeah, that's super interesting. This idea of also sort of like the stereotypes that you were talking about. And I think even now those stereotypes are still so prevalent, right? And I've seen this sort of t-shirts that I love that say like "Calladitas no more," right? And like I love that shirt, like we're not going to be quiet anymore, because I did grow up with this sort of idea that Latinas and Chicanas were quiet, that we didn't speak up. But then when I'm reading your books and your stories, Julissa, that you write, and mainly the books that you've written, and I'm like, wait a minute, like Chicanas were not all just like calladitas and quiet sitting in the back. Like we were making noise and we were fighting for our rights, for the rights of our people. And so I want to take a quick step back. And this is a conversation that is centered on women and Chicanas. And we're going to talk about all that. We're going to come back to that conversation. But I do, because the last few episodes we talked a lot about Latinos hanging on to an idea of whiteness and hanging on to and wanting to be white in order to achieve certain rights, and realizing that even though we were legally white, in some instances, socially and practically, we were not. And we kind of stopped the conversation where we ended the last conversation was talking very briefly about the Chicano movement and how Chicanismo was sort of this awakening of wanting to be seen as Chicanos, not wanting to have rights because we were white, but like truly embracing that Chicano identity. And so I want to take a quick step back to just talking broadly about the Chicano movement. And I'm wondering, Dr. Meili, if you're able to just give us some context for the Chicano movement. Like, what did the Chicano movement do for our people? And what were some of the things that came out of it?
Well, so a lot of people talk about the experience of the World War II generation. So before the birth of the Chicano movement, which was a rejection of American integration and liberal strategies of, if we just work hard enough, we will eventually be included, right? Because that was the generation before in World War II. Mexicano men went to fight in wars, and then they came home and they couldn't even be buried in the cemetery in Texas, for example. So just the rejection of that slower integration of a civil rights approach. And there was earlier kind of GI Forum, earlier LULAC, earlier strategies. These are Latino civil rights organizations. So the Chicano movement was a rejection of that slower integration that may or may not come. It was a rejection of the American pie, right? We just are waiting to get our American pie. And it was like, this pie is actually corrupt. It's based on, thinking about the Vietnam War, right? How are peasants in Vietnam my enemy, and how Chicanos were being killed disproportionately to their population, along with African Americans. So it was a rejection of that kind of American inclusion, that they would ever access the American dream. But it was also a rejection of some of the things you're talking about in terms of like trying to whiten and trying to pass as white. And I think you're referring to the ways that that Mexicans Americans were classified legally as white, but in practice suffered discrimination and segregation historically. And so the Chicano movement was about embracing indigenous identity, saying, we're not actually Spaniards, we're Black, we're indigenous, we're not just about trying to be Hispanic, we're about trying to embrace our multiple identities, our indigenous heritage. And so I think one of the fundamental parts of the Chicano movement was a rejection of just being considered Spanish, right? And so it was trying to introduce a kind of racial complexity. And it was also a rejection of colonialism, right? That Chicanas and Chicanos aren't foreign, aren't immigrants, they're indigenous to this land, to the Americas. So that concept that the border crossed us, we didn't cross the border. Of course, there's people here who were here before the U.S. was the U.S.
Right.
But the Chicano movement was, largely in high schools and school boards in South Texas. And there was 10,000 high school students who walked out in 1968 in Los Angeles. So it was about educational reform. It was about anti-war. It was about housing discrimination, economic inclusion. And it was a cultural revolution, right? So we're talking about the 1960s, the heyday of the counterculture. So just as much as there was Black power and Black is beautiful, there was a movement, Brown is beautiful, and there was a cultural renaissance, right? So I think that's all an important historic shift. So it started new programs, new ethnic studies programs. It fought for political inclusion. The first, representatives in LA, we are all talking about being from Los Angeles here, came from the Chicano movement and fights locally for political inclusion. But I think, in terms of education, in terms of some of those structural and institutional changes, what's a little bit devastating when I teach this to my students is some of those outcomes are still as bad as they were then, right? In terms of graduation, in terms of inclusion, in terms of access, in terms of bilingual education. So I think, there's both of those things to consider, which is there's been a racial retrenchment of the gains of the 1960s and 70s. And then there's also been, I think we see in this current administration, a U-turn from the demands of feminism, right? The acceptance of feminism.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, when you said, this idea of like Brown is beautiful, when I was doing some research about 1968 walkouts in Crystal City, Texas, because the students there there could only be one cheerleader of Mexican American descent, and so all of these students walked out, and they had these posters that said, "Chicana, brown legs are beautiful too. We want Chicana cheerleaders." And I was like, this is amazing and beautiful. And I can't believe I never learned this about this when I was in school until, I'm going to be 38 years old soon. And I'm just learning about some of these things because I also, in college, I wasn't even aware that there was these courses to take, like I didn't even know that was like a thing you could do. And I went to the University of Texas at Austin. I mean, that's how crazy it is, But Julia, I want to go back to Chicana Revolt, which was so beautiful, and I love it. And if you guys haven't read it, there's also the LA Times also put together this little booklet with all of the stories from the Chicano moratorium, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But Julia, I'm wondering if you can tell me, in speaking with Hilda Jensen, and with Gloria Arellanes, how they felt a sense of pride and belonging in the Chicano movement that encouraged them to become activists.
Definitely. I think the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge it was like, you brought that up already, but that was co-authored with my colleague, Bettita Martinez. I don't know if she's watching, but like the story would not have happened without her. Actually, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know about the Adelitas until Vane told me about them earlier this summer. And so when we interviewed Gloria and Hilda, I think speaking back to what Dr. Blackwell was saying in the context of education, right? We know that there were the walkouts and people were calling for or pushing against like overcrowded schools or subpar education. But the two things that stayed with me, because I used to be in education as well, and it matters so much to me, is that when we talked to Gloria and Hilda about their schooling, like their experience, they both talked about having a very negative schooling experience, right? And so, for example, even though they went to they were both in the Los Angeles area, but different areas. So, for example, Gloria was in El Monte, and her school was not predominantly Mexican. It was kind of a mix of like European Americans or like white people and people of Mexican descent. They might have been here for generations, or maybe they were newcomers. What she described, though, is that, for example, like in the hallways or when they would walk home, the students of Mexican descent always try to stay together because they were scared of walking by themselves. And she also said, like, straight up that, like, there were clashes and sometimes they had to call the cops. There were, like, racial, like race fights, basically, fights between races, right? And that when the cops would come onto the campus, they would always arrest the students of Mexican descent, but not the white students. And then she also described that when she was in class, she would raise her hand, she'd be like, oh, and then she would never get called on. And so there's that. I want to put that, and then we'll go into how it changed their sense of belonging. When we interviewed Hilda, same thing. She was actually in a school that was predominantly Mexican, but she also she said like she was very careful to be like it wasn't all the teachers, but that there were teachers who were like openly racist with their students, right? And there's things that she's like, 50 years have passed and I still remember because they still hurt.
Right.
So in terms of, I guess I want to talk about belonging, as opposed to the exclusion that they felt in these spaces where like you're supposed to belong as a young person. Right? When we talked to them about, okay, so how did you guys join the Brown Berets? You could just like their voices would light up, right? They're like, well, I was cruising on Whittier, and my friends invited me to the Piranha Coffee House, and then I just kept going because I felt like I belonged, right? Like the conversations they were having against police brutality, for better education, all that stuff. It was kind of like, like a response almost to what she was seeing elsewhere. And Hilda was very little. She was like a 14-year-old girl, I think, still in junior high.
Yeah.
And same thing. She said that for her, she'd been kind of because she was still very little, like kind of like taken care of. So she snuck into a Piranha Coffee House with her friend. And that same night, she sees David Sanchez, who became the prime minister of the Brown Berets, get slammed against the squad car. So like right away, things like police brutality and things like you see them, right? And so you know what we're fighting for. But then when we asked them like, what are you proud of? I think what they were most proud of were two things. I remember Hilda mentioned that like her mom sewed the Brown Beret, the women's or the young girls really, their uniforms, and that sense of like pride, like marching along other young women of the same background and knowing that they were organizing for stuff. But they really also really emphasized like the service, right? Like providing medical services for free. I think they got a really big kick out of that, and it's something that they're still very proud of. I hope no. But if you have more questions, let me know.
No, that's great. I do remember reading that, and this is kind of why I asked, because I remember that sentence where I think Hilda said the sense of pride she felt putting that uniform on, marching with other Mexicanos and other Chicanos. And for those of you that may not know who Hilda Jensen is, because I also didn't know who she was, but I had seen her picture everywhere, right? Because her picture is that very famous picture of in her brown beret uniform, I believe. And she has, I don't know what they're called, but the
bandolier thingies are like,
like she looked like a Pancho Villa type, wearing, but yet like her name was never credited, like in so many things that you would see her picture everywhere, but her name never accompanied her picture. And I love how you opened that story with, she reached out to an author of a book and said, hey, by the way, that's my picture you're using. And he finally did give credit to the name. But I think it's just a continuation of this like erasure, like they did all this work, but they weren't credited for it. And maybe credit is not like the thing you do the activism for, but I do think there's this feeling of like completely being erased. And one of the other aspects that I wanted to touch on is art, and art in social movements, because sometimes I don't know if like art creates a social justice movement, or if movements create and birth this art, or maybe they just like happen together and they're born at the same time. But certainly for Chicanas, art played like a big role. And Meli, in one of your essays in Chicana Movidas, and we've put a link for you guys to buy Chicana Movidas. We put a link in the chat so you guys can click on the link and buy the book. But in your essay of Esther Hernandez, who I had seen, particularly the raisin picture, but I didn't know that. But I didn't know that. Sunman, but I didn't know that it was hers. But you wrote this essay about Esther Hernandez, and you beautifully describe her as giving us a new template of action and a new brave way of being. So can you tell us about what that template that she gave us is? And for those that aren't familiar with her work, can you tell us a little bit more about her and the impact that she had, not only in the Chicana movement, but also in the feminist movement?
Yes, so Esther Hernandez is a Yaqui Chicana artist, She's really well known for the Sun Mat and many other images, but she was part of a farm worker town in Dinuba. She always says her dad was the first to join UFW, and she became, politically active as part of the farm worker movement, and she used, her art to like teach. And part of the Chicano movement, and specifically the farm worker movement, used teatro, used art as a form of political education. So as much as the women in the Chicano movement were enacting political change, there was also the enormous work of cultural change, changing ideas, changing representations, changing, hearts and minds. And so the art was as important as theater, film, poetry, all this beautiful cultural renaissance was going on at the time. And Esther Hernandez moved to the Bay Area. She was part of Mujeres Muralistas, the first women muralists, which we often think of muralists as men. And then went on to have like multi-decade career of just stunning work. So it's Esther Hernandez .com if you want to check it out. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. So a lot of her work pays tribute to the female form and its bigger than life representations. She celebrates other women. She also has beautiful work on La Virgen, right? And the Virgin of Guadalupe, and paying tribute to kind of the goddess within, not a distant kind of, over there in the church, Virgencita, but a very personal one that's part of personal transformation. But she's also a lesbian, a Chicana lesbian. So her work has been shown either as part of feminist and lesbian work or as part of farm worker Chicano movement. And she always emphasizes, I'm all those parts, right? Like a kaleidoscope. All those experiences shape my art and who I am. And so she brings forth a kind of queer voice to the Chicano movement, a lesbian voice that I think has been certainly erased in a women's perspective, certainly in Chicano art. And we did an oral history, a collaborative testimonial. We call that artistic testimonial, where, oftentimes in art history, the critic examines the art and writes about it. But in this case, it was a collaboration of both shared interpretation of the pieces of art, but she told her life story through all her artwork. And so I think art is important in work like Esther Hernandez, because as much as trying to create political change and transform institutions, part of the work of liberation is imagining that other world that's possible, right? So Robin D.G. Kelley, a really influential, important Black historian, has called that work, the imaginative work of liberation. The Zapatistas even call it imagining that another world is possible, right? So art does the work of imagining that kind of liberation, the liberation of the body, the liberation of society, Chicana's, sexual freedom. She did that early on. She did that karate, the Virgin of Guadalupe, kicking, she was in her karate outfit, because women were taking so much self-defense. And she wanted to represent the Virgencita that doesn't, as an intercessor, doesn't defend our rights for Chicanas and Chicanos as this passive, victim, but she's a kind of a chingona, who's gonna fight for our rights. So she wanted to represent, those transformations that were happening. So what's important, I think, about the work too, is that it transforms from the inside of the culture what the meaning of Chicana femininity is about, that it's empowered, that it can be powerful, that it can be passionate, and breaking out of that kind of virgin whore dichotomy that I was talking about before. And so, I think it's important what you're saying in terms of also just every liberation struggle that Mexicanos and Chicanos have been in, women have been there. Right. So women have led, of course, in the Mexican Revolution. Our first wave feminism from Mexico is tied to socialism and anarchism, is tied to working class struggle, isn't just a fight for the vote, a liberal agenda, but also the rights of workers, also the rights of to education, right? So it's an important conversation to keep having, but the artwork is the thing. Like Hilda's work, I think the reason why she was so resonant for so many people, her image and her bandaleras, is because of how she represented the possibility of Chicana strength for young women, you know, and that image has been reworked by even contemporary artists like I've seen it on CD covers. Well, that's not that contemporary because what's a CD anymore? But graphic artists, other kinds of artists continue to use that image over time. So I think it's about what does it mean to stand up and be powerful.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, last night I was looking through some of her artwork, and there's one that really like I started crying when I saw it, because it was the one and you probably know the name of it. I can't recall it right now, but it's the one where it's the Statue of Liberty, and like the top half is
La Libertad,
La Libertad, and the top part of it is the Statue of Liberty, like we know it, but then the rest of it is really like a tribute to all of this indigenous parts of her identity, and the bottom of it says Aztlán, and it just reminded me so much of, it's sort of like that reminder that we do have like this indigenous roots that really ground us to this land. And that's something that for me as an immigrant to this country who was undocumented for such a long time has really helped me to know that I belonged here even before I had papers, you know, because like you keep talking how like this like we are indigenous, and therefore like we have a history here that is far lengthier than the United States has been a country.
Going back to your question, sorry, I think I get sidetracked. It's not that I don't, for example, like cleaning stuff, right? Schools, hospitals, nothing can function without cleaning staff. We know this, but we treat these people like they're indispensable. I mean, like they're disposable, not indispensable, right? But if they don't show up one day, everything falls apart. So it's like it's more like devalued labor, right? It's like labor that we know is like essential for things to move forward, but that we don't give it the recognition it deserves. And one of the things that I loved about talking to Dr. Diana Espinosa, who is Dr. Blackwell's colleague, and they co-edited, she told us, you know, and it's true that journalists, like, we're not like, straight up guilty. Like, we always say, like, oh, take us to your leaders, you know, like, and then we interview the leaders, the guy in front of the mic and stuff like that. Actually, like, keep an eye on who's distributing flyers, who's like doing the rest of the work. Because if you guys are writing the first drafts of history and you're focusing on like who they're telling you to focus on, you're kind of perpetuating the same thing. And I think that's very true. You know?
Yeah,
absolutely. So just to really,
I just want to. Oh, could just contribute to that too?
Yes,
is please. Well, Maria Cotera and Diana Espinosa are the co-editors of Chicano Movida. So I think it's such a rich collection because we were all able to collaborate. But the collectivity of the 1960s kind of movement culture, I think, was really important. That Julia's lifting up for Chicanas, it empowered them. People didn't necessarily want to be in the spotlight, right? And so that's kind of like what we were talking about. Are movement leaders the folks who stand in front of the mic, or they want the organizational backbone of the movement, the people who move the whole community towards social change? So some of the African-American activists in the 60s say, oh, men were the jawbone of the movement, but women were the backbone, right? And it's not a way to like devalue men per se, but it's a way to think about the exactly kind of the female labor that's been devalued that Julia's talking about. And Rosie Castro, one of the leaders of the La Raza Unida party, talked about, she says, our leadership is one that empowers others, right? So it's not putting themselves first. So I think that's another reason why a lot of Chicanas weren't seen as leaders.
Yeah. And so that's a perfect segue actually to my next question. So I want to go back to Martha's essay, Mujeres Bravas. You can see that this essay really stayed with me because she says that, you know, they were there, like with Chicanas were there trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, but she calls it the last hurrah of Chicanas' involvement with the feminist movement because she writes, quote, that the passion of white women leader for preserving the privilege of their race, class, and heterosexual preferences outweighed liberation for every woman. So it seems like Chicanas were squeezed out of the feminist white feminist movement, or the mainstream feminist movement. And then, Julia, in your piece, right, this Chicana revolt really happened because of the way that Chicanas were being treated in mostly men environments, right, where they say they were treated as they were not treated as revolutionary sisters. They were treated no better than the quote pig system was treating them. And so it seems like Chicanas kind of were, maybe, I don't know if having a difficult time taking up space in these different other spaces, but it certainly does seem like they had to create their own space. So how did that happen? How did Chicanas create their own space? Having been, I don't know if I want to call it squeezed out, because that sounds like they were just like, okay, we're going to leave. But certainly it seems like they were pushed in many of these different spaces.
Let's take a stab at this, and then maybe Julia can. So I think the problem is actually twofold. One is that it's an erasure in the process of historicizing. So women certainly were in the women's movement, as Marta Cortera's piece. I suggest everyone read it. It's like a hand guide to like rebellion, I working with like people you have a difficult time working with. And whoever heard that Chicanas were on the front line of the ERA, right? We never hear that. And that Chicanas were part of the what we think of as the white women's movement or the women's movement. But they were also at the front line of the Chicano movement. So I think that's a process of erasure that's happened in the historicizing of both movements, a whitewashing and a tendency to only record some of the male histories until recently. But also in the history itself, Chicanas just did the work, right? So they did the work in the Chicano movement, they did the work in the women's movement, and then they created their spaces. So Las Adalitas is a great example of how they created their own space. And they often had to do a double time activism. So I write about an earlier organization, Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, and I mentioned Ana Nieto Gomez. And so they founded that women's student organization, but they still were in Mecha. So they did double time activism to try to get their issues as women addressed. So there's a lot of different strategies women used to, like they sometimes they went low riding in the women's movement. That's one saying that someone has to talk about like the spaces they occupied within movements that were subversive. They also created spaces in between movements, right? Between the farm worker movement and, the women's movement, between the Chicano movement and the, just then budding early gay liberation movement, those kinds of in and between movements. So they wove those spaces in together. So, they often met in hallways after the meetings. Our book talks about that, right? So not only transforming the culture, the hallway movie that was like, if we're not in the space, we have to meet literally in between the spaces of the meeting to try to get our agenda. And you see that again and again in the Chicano movement. And, Marta Cortera's piece gives us a beautiful guide to how to do it in movements that exclude ours.
Yeah. And people were asking what the name of the essay is called. And I think it's called Mujeres Bravas.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called Mujeres Bravas. But Julia, do you want to add to that specifically within the Chicano movement and what was kind of happening there?
Yeah, definitely. And I would just add to what Dr. Blanco was saying. When we talked to Dr. Espinosa, she told us for example, sometimes like Gloria Llanes and the women did bring their concerns to the leadership, but they were not listened to. So they felt, there's no space for us here, so we have to move out, but we're still going to be in the Chicano movement, right? In other situations, like if there was like women in a political parties, no matter how misogyny, how strong it is, there are still rules you have to follow. So it's kind of like women, like what Dr. Blanco was saying, like figuring out how I'm gonna like navigate this space, right? Which is what we're kind of accustomed to do. And like I really like when I look back in time and I see that in that moment women were already like no, or like correcting the record. So for example, in the letter that the resignation letter that the women of the Brown Berets turned in, I think like if I'm not mistaken, like the very last sentence is like, contrary to what the men are saying that we were suspended or temporarily suspended, we officially resigned. Right? And that's something that like now, like decades later, we can be like, these women were already like correcting the record. Right? And same thing in the article, we mentioned that Oscar Zeta Costa wrote this like love letter to the women of Aztlan, and it's even like
I laughed so hard.
it's worse. It's worse. So if you read the whole thing, it's like, and the accompanying art, it's like, in my opinion, very sexist. And the woman who wrote back, the Chicana de Pittsburgh, remained anonymous, right? I was like, girl, please. But thank you for responding, because what she responded that was cool. Aside from saying like, no, thank you. She brought up, cause like, one of the allegations he makes is that like Chicanas were just copying white women's notes, right? To kind of like undermine any calls for equality. And what she's like, she brings up Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right? Like a poet, nun from like before Mexico even existed. Like, just to be like, like misogyny has been with us, and we have been pushing back against it for centuries. So don't tell me that we're copying, So I think that's what I love about going into like the archives. Is like to see like that, yeah, like the historical narratives that we get. People have been selective about what they're gonna write. Like
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
I love the response, which was like, yeah, I mean, it was like a very like super sexist letter. Like when I read it, I was like cringing, but I love the response that was like, your letter sounds like a proposition and not a very good one at that. And I was like, yes, girl, like it was not a good proposition. This sucked. But one of the, in reading Martha's essay and sort of like not wanting, I think, I've been thinking a lot about why I wanted to do this series, because like this series has seriously taken over my entire life for the past 4 weeks. And I kept thinking like, why am I so obsessed with like telling these stories? And I think part of it is because I see it happening again, like in my own life and like in my own experiences. I see the contributions of Latinas, of Chicanas being erased like all over again. Right. And not being a part of these like movements. So there was this recent women's initiative that was started, and it was started by one of the very well-known feminist icons. And I'm like looking through it and I'm trying to see. And so they have the Lotus Huerta on their homepage, right, with the huelga sign. And so I was like, all right, let me look into this. So I started looking into it. All the founding members, right? Founding members on. There's one Latina founding member. There are more men founding members of this initiative than there are Latinas founding members. And it just kind of really punched me in the gut, because I was like, it's the same people from the 70s that were erasing Latinas, erasing us all over again. And so I actually like wrote them, and I was like, this is unconscionable that you would launch this with one Latina, because there are more. How can there be more men in a thing that's supposed to be about women than there are Latinas here? And anyways, I just wanted to share that, because had I not read Chicana Movidas, I don't know that I would have done that. But it really gave me the empowerment. It gave me the power to say, not again. Not again. And I think that's what's really important about the work that both of you are doing in telling these stories, and and I loved how you, Millie, in the book in Chicana Movidas, how you guys were talking about we're not just telling the stories of the people, we're also letting those people tell their histories. And I think that's so important. It's like so many of these people are still alive, and like let's actually hear from them and like hear their stories. So anyways, we're going to open it up to Q&A, but I do want to get to this one last question, and I'll make it I'll make it shorter. So I was watching this panel on YouTube, and it was various Latinas who would be their first in their districts to get elected to Congress. So like the first Latina from Kansas, the first Afro-Latina to be elected. And all of these people are up for election in November. It's 5 Latinas. And they all talked about either being part of the Chicano movement as like teenagers or very young girls, or learning about the Chicano movement and how much it impacted them, and how that really propelled their desire to be involved in politics and their desire to want to work for bettering our community. And then I thought about Hilda and Gloria, and how they were so in it, but then they were so disillusioned by everything that happened in the movement, by the Chicano moratorium, where where Chicanos were fighting against the Vietnam War, and it led to Ruben Salazar, who was an LA Times journalist, to be killed by police, and that kind of was really a turning point. So I'm wondering what both of you see now as threats to disillusioning us and disillusioning perhaps younger activists that would otherwise be involved. And I'll start with you, Julia.
Okay. Let's see. I think I want to push back a little. I don't think it's inaccurate to say that they were disillusioned, but I think they were more like traumatized, to be honest. Because we asked them, and for example, like Ruben Salazar was killed, but so was like a little boy. He was 15 years old, named Lynn Ward. Gloria knew him, and she went to his funeral. And what she told me was just like, both of them, they were just like, seeing that kind of violence, like the violent reaction to what's supposed to be a peaceful protest, it traumatized them. When people started inviting Gloria until the decades later, like come to the panel, the Chicano like moratorium panel, they would show her the videos, and she said that she would just cry, and then so I think these women, like I think it would take a lot to see that and come out, unscathed. And I don't think that's what you were trying to say anyway. But there was, for example, like a lot of infiltration. I think when I read about it, people said like, oh, the infighting is what brought the Chicano movement down. Da, 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 da. I don't buy into that. I think it's more like in terms of what could disillusion or undermine like today's like activist movements is just like, again, like to make a hierarchy about what's most important, and to be like, okay, we're gonna fight against racism, then we'll deal with this stuff, right? Or to straight up be homophobic or transphobic or all the other different things, or to not even address colorism, or to fail to make coalitions with people who don't look like you. I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and not just things that went wrong, but things that went really right. Because, for example, like not all the Chicano men were super sexist, right? Some of them, like Rosalio Munoz, was in fact like the one who invited Guardianes to like come to these panels, because he was like, we need to have your voice, that kind of thing. But I think when I look back on that, it's like above all, thinking that you alone have the answer and that your priority is the priority, right? So, for example, like I might be really invested in climate change, and someone who's really interested in grappling with the unequal distribution of wealth, right? And like no one, like I hear this a lot lately, that what we can all mobilize around is climate change, because if the world disappears, we all disappear. And that's true. But that doesn't mean like environmental racism, for example, is like pretty well documented. Right. You can walk and chew gum at the same time, So all this to say, that like not prioritizing one concern over another.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a good point. And I certainly, like, when I say disillusioned, I do really mean like I think traumatized is a better word. Like but my question was really more about like, what are the threats to continuing to do this work? And I think you've answered some of it. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree with Julia that state violence is a concern right now. We are in a political context where the police are being mobilized to put down protests as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And certainly Latina, Latino, Latinx folks are part of that movement against police brutality. Certainly the Chicano moratorium, like looking back 50 years since the Chicano moratorium, it's been a fight against police brutality and imperialism, right? Those two things about state violence, the struggle has been ongoing. I think, Julia was mentioning COINTELPRO, right? The movements, yes, there was a lot of political infighting, but there was also state intervention and mass violence. But when I share, the work on women in the Chicano movement, I get young women say, I'm part of the undocumented student movement, and women's voices are suppressed, or we're asked to do all the service, or queer folks come up and say, hey, yeah, so they asked me to foreground my undocumented identity, but, to hide my trans or my queer identity. So exactly what Julia is saying is that we have to be our full selves, right? That Chicana feminism gives us a blueprint of multi-issue struggles, right? So environmental racism is tied to economic justice and redistribution, is tied to racism. The fight against white supremacy is tied to dismantling heteropatriarchy, right? That we can be in a multi-issue movement, but we also have multiple identities and systems of power we have to address and talk about. But I also think what's a little bit different now, and I'm in touch with Grandma Gloria Arianes. She's an amazing activist and healer and storyteller. I'm more working with her in her role as a Tongva cultural educator for the Mapping Indigenous LA project I work with. But I think that it's true that there's been a hierarchy of oppression, right? Mm-hmm. First we have to do this, then we do that. And so what I see now is that activists and society are seeing these interconnections, and people are insisting on being their full selves and having the whole conversation. But also that there's healing justice. And so that's why I was raising Grandma Gloria, that part of healing the trauma, healing intergenerational trauma, healing the trauma of colonialism, right? These are kind of the core wounds, right, that Chicanas and Chicanos suffer from, and that these are all interconnected. And so people are, I feel like, doing better work taking care of themselves as part of the broader liberation movement, right? That we do our own healing as well as do our work of social transformation, that those two fronts of struggle are actually connected. So as much as I think there's reason to despair, certainly right now in this political moment, there's also reasons to think about the kind of transformative justice and transformative healing that's happening in social movement spaces and within the culture at large. And so we have to stay connected to that, especially right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's so important. Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Here's one. What can we do to make sure that the people behind the scenes get credit? How can we do a better job of centering the contributions of Chicanas? For anybody that wants to take it.
So this project, Chicano Movement, wouldn't have happened without Maria Cotera, who's the daughter of Martha Cotera, by the way. Yep. And what if Julia at UT Austin, Martha still lives there and she gives lectures. So if Martha Cotera had, lectured in one of Julia's classes. So holding each other up, like certainly this project would not have happened, especially without our sisters Dion and Maria. And then also working differently. I think we're transforming some of kind of the Western individualism of our work. And that's amazing to work collectively, but our systems of power do certainly give credit only on the individual level. So thinking about how to speak up and be empowered, but do it in a collective way, I think that was certainly why many Chicanas in that kind of collective spirit is why people didn't give credit, to who's in the photo, who wrote the article, right? That classic anonymous was a woman, right? Yeah. So I think it's both things, remembering the individual and the collective.
Yeah, that's a lot to be learned, and a lot more to do. Here's one more question, and this will be our last question because we have gone a little long. I really appreciate you staying with me and keeping this going. So, as an East Coast Chicana, Chicanx, I grew up admiring West Coast Chicanx resistance subculture. Do the panelists have any information on East Coast resistance mobilization aside from the Young Lords and Black Panthers? Do you guys have any? I would say, so I will say this. I forget who asked that question just now, but I do agree that there is, I almost feel like I had to move to Los Angeles to become a real activist. And what I mean by that is, I lived in New York for a long time. I mean, also when I lived in New York, I had a completely different life. Like I worked on Wall Street and I was like I had a totally different life. I was not, an activist. And then I grew up in Texas, where I think Latinos in Texas are different. Like there's a difference between Latinos in Texas and Latinos in California, and that in my own experience. And I almost do feel like I had to move to Los Angeles to to become an activist, because there is a lot of that history here. But now learning about it, there were huge movements that were happening in Texas also. Right, I very briefly mentioned 1968 in Crystal City, Texas, but there were huge walkouts similar to the ones that happened in Los Angeles. So Texas is actually also a place that I would encourage people to look at and learn about Chicano history and Chicano movement, because it was happening in a big way in Texas also.
I would also mention Bettita Martinez. She's one of the major Chicanas of this era. And she was part of the New York chapter of SNCC. She's a Chicana. And so she came out of, I hold up the Young Lords too, and the women of the Young Lords certainly. If you haven't checked out Iris Morales's books and documentary, Palante Siempre Palante, it's amazing. So I highly recommend that. But also, you know, Chicanas, it's somewhat geographic, right? That there weren't so many folks in New York at that time. Certainly there are now, of Mexican descent. But in the project that we just finished, the Midwest is really central because those histories haven't been told, right? Of Kansas, of Michigan, so the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, East Coast, I think that's still to be done, the research, the work, and certainly movements now. And I think there's a really important thread there, which is the proximity of Blackness and Latinidad on the East Coast. And I think that's an important conversation and tradition of struggle, right? That the Young Lords held up, right? That there were Black members part of the Young Lords movement, right? That the Young Lords were a Puerto Rican organization that came out of Chicago and New York. So I think that history, I hope that person who asked that question is thinking about how to, you know, recover these histories. But for the Chicano movement, I think the person who stands out to me in New York would be Bettita Martinez, because she was formed in SNCC, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with African-American organizers before she moved to New Mexico later and became part of the New Mexican Land Grant Movement, which was another really important group movement.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have gone on a little longer than we normally have, but the conversation was just so amazing, and I had so many more questions for both of you. I could do a whole 4-part series just talking to both of you. So
let's do it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's do it. Thank you so much for being with us. And I just want to say to everyone that has been with us this last 4 weeks, it has really been one of the best things. I can honestly say one of the best things that I have done in my life is do this series. And I really, really hope that we can continue it, because there's so much more to uncover. There are so many more stories to be told. And I just want to say thank you to Mei Lee and Julia. I keep wanting to be like Professor Blackwell, because, you know, you're like a professor. So I want to like respect that. But I'm also like, Mei Lee, such a cool name.
That's my day job. Yeah. I'm a person.
Exactly. So Julia and Mei Lee, thank you so much for being with us. And to everyone who joined us this last 4 weeks, thank you. All 4 episodes are going to be up on YouTube and Facebook. And so make sure that you share them with someone who wasn't able to watch them live. Send us comments and let us know if you want to hear more of these types of stories. And a last really huge, immense thank you to Ana Flores, who I swear to God, this would not have happened without her. I mean, I was desperate to do something like this, and she has provided all of the infrastructure to do these conversations. We All Grow Latina is just an amazing community of Latinas who empower each other, who help each other, and who are bringing each other up as the community is growing and succeeding. So thank you, and thank you to Puede, Latino Rebels, and BESE for their partnership as well. Thank you so much.